courtroom was dead silent, the kind of silence that screams before an explosion. On the witness stand sat Officer Derek Vance, a man with a badge on his chest and a smirk he couldn't quite wipe off. He thought he had this in the bag, just another conviction, another statistic. He looked at the defendant, a man in a sharp navy suit named Magnus Thorne, and saw nothing but prey. But Vance didn't know the truth. He didn't know that the criminal he planted drugs on wasn't just a driver. He was the United States Assistant Attorney for the Southern District, a federal prosecutor who had put away cartels, and today he was hunting a different kind of monster. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The air in courtroom 4B was stale, smelling of floor wax and anxious sweat. It was the smell of desperate people hoping for mercy from a system designed to grind them into dust. Judge Harriet Moore sat behind the mahogany bench, her face a mask of bored patience. She had seen it all, or at least she thought she had. She adjusted her spectacles, glancing down at the docket. State v. Thorne, possession with intent to distribute, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. The charges were heavy, the kind that ruined lives, the kind that ended careers before they began. At the prosecutor's table sat Assistant District Attorney, ADA, Kyle Rourke. Rourke was young, hungry, and entirely too confident. He was tapping his pen against a yellow legal pad, already mentally tallying this as a win. Why wouldn't he? He had the testimony of a decorated veteran officer, the physical evidence, and the arrest report. It was a slam dunk. On the defense side sat Magnus Thorne. Thorne didn't look like a man facing 10 to 20 years in a maximum security prison. He sat perfectly still, his posture erect, his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him. He wore a bespoke navy suit that fit his broad shoulders like armor. His tie was a deep crimson, tied in a perfect Windsor knot. He didn't have a lawyer. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Moore said, her voice echoing slightly in the wood-paneled room. "I see you are representing yourself today. Prosecutor, I must remind you again, as I did at the arraignment, that this is highly inadvisable, given the severity of the charges against you. The court can appoint a public defender if—" "Thank you, Your Honor," Thorne cut in, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "But I am quite comfortable proceeding on my own behalf." Ada Rourke suppressed a scoff. Another jailhouse lawyer, he thought. Thinks he knows the law because he watched a few episodes of Law and Order. "Very well," Judge Moore sighed, rubbing her temples. "Opening statements. Mr. Rourke?" Rourke stood up, buttoning his jacket. He strode to the center of the room, making eye contact with the jury. He knew how to play them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rourke began, his voice dropping to a somber, serious tone. "We trust our law enforcement officers to keep our streets safe. They put their lives on the line every single day. On the night of October 14th, Officer Derek Vance stopped the defendant for a broken tail light. Simple, routine. But what he found was not simple. A bag of methamphetamine under the driver's seat, and when Officer Vance attempted to do his duty, the defendant fought back. He attacked an officer of the law. Today, the evidence will show that Magnus Thorne is not a victim. He is a criminal who got caught." Rourke walked back to his table, shooting a smug look at Thorne. Thorne stood up. He didn't rush. He buttoned his suit jacket slowly, walked to the center of the room, and looked at the jury. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He looked at them with an intensity that made the foreman, an older man in a flannel shirt, shift uncomfortably in his seat. "The state claims I am a criminal," Thorne said, his voice calm, terrifyingly controlled. "They claim I possessed drugs. They claim I assaulted an officer. But claims require proof, and proof requires truth. Today you are going to hear a story. It's a story you've heard before, a traffic stop, a search, a bag of drugs. But the ending of this story is different, because in this story, the man in the car saw everything, and by the time we are done, you will realize that the only crime committed on October 14th was committed by the man wearing the badge. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Officer Derek Vance, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery, chewing gum. Thorne's gaze was cold, surgical. It was the look of a man who already knew the outcome of the game. Vance stopped chewing for a second, a flicker of unease passing through him, before he forced a smirk and leaned back. He had no idea who he was looking at. "The prosecution calls Officer Derek Vance to the stand," Rourke announced. Vance stood up, smoothing out his uniform. He was a big man, bulky with muscle that was slowly turning to fat. He had a buzz cut and eyes that looked like two chips of flint. He walked to the stand with a swagger, the jingle of his utility belt announcing his presence. He took the oath, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thorne watched him. He watched the way Vance's eyes darted to the jury, seeking approval. He watched the way his hand rested on his thigh, near his gun. He was analyzing him, breaking him down, cataloguing every tick and micro-expression. "Officer Vance," Rourke started, leaning against the podium, "walk us through the night of October 14th. Vance cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone. "Yes, sir. I was on patrol in the 4th District. Around 11:30 p.m., I observed a black sedan, license plate ending in 4 to 9 Zulu, traveling westbound with a non-functioning taillight. I initiated a traffic stop." "And what happened next?" "The driver, the defendant over there, was agitated immediately," Vance said, pointing a thick finger at Thorne. "He refused to roll down his window more than an inch. I asked for license and registration. He was arguing, being non-compliant. I smelled a strong chemical odor coming from the vehicle." "A chemical odor?" Rourke asked, feigning surprise. "Like what?" "Like meth, sir. I've been on the force 15 years. I know the smell." Thorne scribbled something on his legal pad. "Strike one." "I asked the driver to step out of the vehicle," Vance continued, warming up to his lie. "He refused. He started reaching under his seat. I feared for my safety. I thought he was reaching for a weapon. So I opened the door and extracted him from the vehicle. That's when he swung at me." "He hit you?" "Yes, sir. Glancing blow to the shoulder. I had to subdue him. Once he was cuffed, I searched the immediate area where he was reaching. That's when I found it. A baggie containing 50 grams of crystal meth." The jury gasped softly. 50 grams was a lot. That wasn't recreational. That was dealing. Rourke nodded solemnly. "Thank you, officer." No further questions. Judge Moore looked at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, your witness?" The courtroom went quiet. This was usually the part where the defendant stuttered, got angry, or asked irrelevant questions. Vance looked bored, ready to deflect whatever amateur questions this guy had. Thorne stood up. He didn't take any notes with him to the podium. He didn't need them. "Officer Vance," Thorne said, his voice pleasant, almost friendly. "You stated you have been on the force for 15 years. You're a veteran." "That's right," Vance grunted. "You know the law inside and out. You know procedure." "I do." "Good," Thorne said. He walked around the table, moving closer to the witness stand. "You stated that I was agitated immediately, that I refused to roll down my window." "That's correct." "And that you smelled a chemical odor." "Yes." "Officer Vance, was your body camera active during this stop?" Vance hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "It was malfunctioning. Tech issues. It happens. I noted it in my report. Ah, yes. Technical issues, Thorne said, nodding slowly. Convenient. And your dash cam. The angle was bad. The vehicle was parked too close to the curve. It didn't catch the interior. So we have no video evidence of the smell, or the reaching, or the assault. We only have your word. My word is good enough for the citizens of this county, Vance snapped, his face reddening slightly. I'm sure it is, Thorne said. Let's talk about the reaching under the seat. You said I was reaching for a weapon. It looked like it. So you pulled me out, violently. I used necessary force to neutralize a threat. Officer Vance, Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming harder. When you pulled me out of the car, did you see a weapon? No, I found drugs. Right. The drugs. Thorne walked back to his table and picked up a piece of paper. I have here the evidence log. It says the drugs were found wedged under the driver's seat rail. Is that correct? Yes. Officer, do you know what kind of car I drive? Vance blinked. A sedan. A Mercedes, I think. A 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class, Thorne corrected. Are you aware of the seat configuration of that specific model? I don't sell cars, pal. I just stop 'em. Objection. Rourke stood up. Relevance? I'll make it relevant, Your Honor, Thorne said, without looking away from Vance. Overruled. Continue, Judge Moore said, leaning forward. She sensed something. The rhythm of the cross-examination was too precise. The 2024 S-Class, Thorne continued, has a sealed underseat compartment for the electronics that control the massage and heating functions. There is no space under the rail to wedge a bag of that size, unless, of course, you ripped the paneling off. Vance shifted in his seat. Maybe it was next to the rail. I don't remember the exact inch. But you remember the smell? You remember the aggression? Your memory seems selective, officer. I found the drugs, Vance shouted, losing his cool. You're a dealer. Stop trying to twist words. Thorne smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that had just tasted blood. I'm not twisting words, Officer Vance. I'm just setting the scene. Thorne paused, looking at the jury, then back at Vance. You said my window was up, that I wouldn't roll it down. That's right. Then how did you smell the chemical odor before the door was opened? Silence. Vance's mouth opened, then closed. The vents. Through the vents. Through the vents, Thorne repeated, incredulous. You smelled meth through the vents of a sealed, luxury vehicle with a HEPA air filtration system while standing outside on a windy highway. It was a strong smell. It must have been, Thorne said. Tell me, Officer Vance, have you ever heard of the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine? I'm not a lawyer. No, you're not. But you should be aware that if the reason for the search, the smell, is a lie, then the search is illegal, and the evidence is inadmissible. It wasn't a lie. Thorne turned his back on Vance. Your Honor, at this time, I would like to introduce Defense Exhibit A. Rourke stood up. Objection. The defense has not shared any exhibits during discovery. On the contrary, Thorne said, picking up a small flash drive from his table. This evidence was submitted to the district attorney's office 3 days ago. Perhaps Mr. Rourke didn't check his inbox. He turned to Rourke. File name, Vance-Backup. Rourke went pale. He started rifling through his files. What is this evidence, Mr. Thorne? Judge Moore asked. Officer Vance claimed his body camera malfunctioned, Thorne said, holding the drive up like a holy relic. And he claimed his dashcam had a bad angle. But Officer Vance made a mistake. He forgot that modern police cruisers, specifically the Dodge Chargers used by this precinct, have a secondary backup recording system that activates when the light bar is turned on. It uploads directly to the cloud, bypassing the local storage on the unit. It's a fail-safe for when officers lose footage. Vance gripped the railing of the witness stand. His knuckles were white. "And," Thorne continued, "I happen to have a subpoena power that allowed me to access the cloud server of the precinct's third-party vendor. Would you like to see what really happened on October 14th? The courtroom erupted. Judge Moore banged her gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" She looked at Thorne with wide eyes. "Play the tape!" The courtroom lights were dimmed. The silence was heavy, suffocating. All eyes were glued to the large projection screen that had been rolled into the center of the well. Technical difficulties usually plagued courtroom presentations: bad audio, fuzzy pictures, incompatible files. But Thorne had come prepared. The video feed from the backup cloud server was crisp, high definition, and damning. On the screen, the timestamp read October 10, 23 or 28 to 15. The footage showed the rear of a sleek black Mercedes S-Class. The brake lights were on, casting a red glow on the wet asphalt. Officer Vance walked into the frame. The audio crackled to life. "License and registration," Vance's voice barked. It sounded aggressive, impatient. In the video, the window of the Mercedes slid down. Not an inch, as Vance had testified, but fully. "Good evening, officer," came Magnus Thorne's voice. It was calm, polite. "Is there a problem? I believe I was traveling within the speed limit." "Taillights out," Vance snapped. "You deaf? I asked for license and registration." "I'm reaching into my jacket pocket for my wallet," Thorne narrated his movements, a standard procedure for law enforcement officers when stopped, to signal non-aggression. On the witness stand, the real Derek Vance was sweating. A single bead of perspiration rolled down his temple. He knew what was coming. On the screen, Vance didn't wait. He yanked the door handle. It was locked. "Open the damn door!" Vance shouted. "Officer, I am complying. Please step back," Thorne said. "I smell narcotics. Get out of the car." The courtroom gasped. The window had been down for seconds. There was no hesitation, no chemical odor discussion before the escalation. Then came the violence. The video showed Vance drawing his baton. He smashed the driver's side window. Glass shattered outward and inward. He unlocked the door, ripped it open, and grabbed Thorne by the lapels of his suit. "Get your ass out here!" Vance hauled Thorne onto the wet pavement. Thorne didn't swing. He didn't fight. He immediately went to his knees, hands interlocked behind his head. It was textbook compliance. "Stop resisting!" Vance screamed to an empty street, playing to an audience that wasn't there, trying to create an audio record for a fight that wasn't happening. He drove a knee into Thorne's back, pressing his face into the gravel. Then, the moment that sucked the air out of the room, the camera angle was from the roof bar, looking down. It had a perfect view of Vance's right hand. As Vance pinned Thorne with his left hand, his right hand moved to his own utility belt. He dipped 2 fingers into a small pouch near his handcuffs, retrieved a clear plastic baggie, and in one fluid motion, flicked it under the open door of the Mercedes. It was sleight of hand, a magic trick. But the camera caught the magician. "Found it!" Vance yelled on the video. "We got meth! You're done, dirtbag!" Thorne, face pressed to the ground, spoke clearly, his voice muffled but audible. "Officer, you are making a grave mistake. My name is Magnus Thorne. I am an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District. You have just planted evidence on a federal officer." Vance on the video laughed. A cruel, mocking sound. "Yeah? And I'm the King of Siam. Shut up." The screen went black. The lights in the courtroom flickered back on. For 10 seconds, no one moved. The jury looked horrified. The foreman's mouth was hanging open. Judge Moore looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. She slowly turned her head toward Adia Rourke. Rourke was staring at his table, his face the color of ash. He realized he had just prosecuted an innocent man, a powerful innocent man, based on the lies of a dirty cop. His career wasn't just over, it was incinerated. Thorne stood at the podium. He looked calm, but his eyes were blazing. "Officer Vance," Thorne said, his voice slicing through the silence. "Is that you in the video?" Vance slumped in the chair. The arrogance was gone. He looked small. It looks like angle tricks. Shadows." "Shadows?" Thorne asked, stepping closer. "Did a shadow break my window? Did a shadow pull a bag of methamphetamine out of your belt pouch? Did a shadow tell a federal prosecutor that you were the king of Siam?" I didn't know who you were," Vance whispered. It was the worst thing he could have said. Thorne paused. He let the words hang there. "You didn't know who I was," Thorne repeated. "And that is the point, isn't it? If I were a plumber, or a teacher, or a mechanic, that baggie would have sent me to prison for 10 years. You didn't care about the truth. You cared about a stat. You cared about a seizure." "Objection," Rourke squeaked, purely out of reflex. He didn't even have a legal basis. "Grounds?" Judge Moore snapped at Rourke. "I withdraw," Rourke mumbled, sinking lower in his chair. Thorne turned back to Vance. "Let's talk about that baggie, officer. 50 grams of pure methamphetamine. That's a felony quantity. Where did you get it?" "I found it in your car," Vance insisted, though his voice shook. "We just saw you take it from your belt. So I ask you again, under penalty of perjury, where did you get it?" Vance clamped his mouth shut. He looked at his union rep in the back of the room, who was furiously shaking his head no. "Pleading the fifth?" Thorne asked. "In front of a jury?" "Brave." Thorne walked back to his table and picked up a thick binder. He dropped it on the table with a loud thud. "Your Honor, the defense has one more line of questioning regarding the witness's credibility. It pertains to his previous employment in the narcotics division." Judge Moore nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Thorne, but make it quick. I think the jury has seen enough to form an opinion." "Oh, this isn't for the jury, Your Honor," Thorne said, buttoning his jacket. "This is for the record." The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from a legal proceeding to a public execution. Vance wasn't just a witness anymore. He was the accused, and the man questioning him wasn't a defendant. He was the executioner. "Officer Vance," Thorne began, flipping open the binder. "In 2018, you were the lead officer on the State vs. Henderson case. Do you remember it?" Vance wiped his forehead. "I've worked hundreds of cases. Let me refresh your memory. Tyrone Henderson, stopped for a broken taillight, resisted arrest, found with 50 grams of methamphetamine. Does that sound familiar?" Vance stayed silent. "What about 2019? State vs. Davies, broken taillight, resisting, 50 grams of meth." Thorne flipped a page. 2020, State v. Ruiz, broken taillight, resisting, 50 grams. Thorne looked up. "It's a remarkable coincidence, officer. Everyone you stop for a broken taillight seems to carry the exact same amount of drugs. It's almost as if it's the same bag." The jury began to whisper. Rourke buried his face in his hands. "Now," Thorne continued, "Mr. Rourke here didn't know about this pattern. Why? Because you never logged the drugs into the main evidence locker immediately. You kept them in your personal lockbox for processing, sometimes for days. Is that correct?" "It's standard procedure when the lab is backed up," Vance lied. "No, it isn't," Thorne said sharply. "It is a violation of Department Policy 402B. But let's move past policy. Let's talk about why I was on that road that night." Thorne turned to the gallery. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall, grey-haired man in a dark suit walked in, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. The room murmured. The lawyers knew who he was. David Sterling, the United States Attorney, the top federal law enforcement official in the region. He didn't walk into traffic court cases. Ever. Sterling walked past the bar and took a seat directly behind Thorne. He didn't say a word. He just stared at Officer Vance. "Officer Vance," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You claimed I was just a driver. You claimed you didn't know me. That is true. You didn't know that for the past 6 months, the Department of Justice has been running a clandestine operation titled Operation Blue Stain." Vance's eyes went wide. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. "We weren't investigating drug dealers, officer," Thorne said. "We were investigating a ring of corrupt officers in the 4th Precinct who were shaking down motorists, planting evidence, and seizing cash and cars for personal gain. We knew the who. We just needed the how." Thorne leaned in close to the microphone. "I wasn't stopped by accident, Derek. I was trolling. I drove a luxury car through your sector at night with a fuse pulled on my taillight. I was fishing. And you took the bait." The courtroom exploded. Reporters in the back row were frantically typing on their phones. The jurors were looking at each other in shock. This wasn't a defense. It was a sting operation. "That night," Thorne continued, his voice rising over the noise, "you didn't arrest a suspect. You arrested the lead prosecutor of the task force assigned to take you down." "This is entrapment," Vance yelled, standing up. "You set me up." "Entrapment," Thorne said calmly, "requires me to coerce you into committing a crime you wouldn't otherwise commit. Did I force you to plant that baggie? Did I force you to lie in your report? Did I force you to perjure yourself in this chair 5 minutes ago?" Vance looked around wildly. He looked at the judge, at Rourke, at the U.S. Marshals standing by the door. There was no exit. "Your Honor," Thorne turned to Judge Moore, "the defense rests, and acting in my capacity as Assistant United States Attorney, I am placing Officer Derek Vance under federal arrest for deprivation of civil rights, under color of law, perjury, and distribution of a controlled substance." Judge Moore banged her gavel, but not to silence the room. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, her voice icy, "I assume the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Thorne?" Rourke stood up, his legs shaking. Yes, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss with prejudice, immediately." "Charges dismissed," Judge Moore said. "Officer Vance, you are remanded into the custody of the U.S. Marshals. Get him out of my courtroom." As the Marshals moved in, cuffing Vance's hands behind his back, real cuffs this time, not the ones he used on victims, Vance looked at Thorne. "You ruined my life," Vance spat. Thorne began packing his briefcase. He didn't even look up. "No, Derek, you ruined your own. I just turned on the lights." The dismissal of the case was instant, but the fallout was just beginning. The video of the courtroom confrontation leaked within the hour. By the time Magnus Thorne walked out of the courthouse steps, news vans were already blocking the street. But Thorne didn't stop for interviews. He walked straight to the waiting black SUV where David Sterling was waiting. "Hell of a show, Magnus," Sterling said as Thorne climbed in. "It wasn't a show, David. It was necessary," Thorne replied, loosening his tie for the first time that day. He looked tired. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold reality of what had happened. "We got the warrant," Sterling said, handing Thorne a tablet. Based on Vance's testimony and the video, a federal judge signed off on a raid of the 4th Precinct lockers. "We're hitting them tonight." Thorne looked out the window as the city passed by. Vance wasn't working alone. The way Rourke tried to bury the discovery, the way the evidence log was forged, the rot goes deeper. "Rourke is already suspended," Sterling noted. "The state bar is opening an inquiry. He'll be disbarred by Christmas. But the captain, Captain Miller, that's the big fish." "Miller protects his own," Thorne said. "Vance won't flip on him. Vance is scared of Miller more than he's scared of prison." "Then we need to make him more scared of prison," Sterling said. "Your lead on the interrogation?" "No," Thorne shook his head. "I was the victim. Conflict of interest. It won't stick if I'm the one squeezing him." "Technically, yes," Sterling smiled slightly. "But Vance doesn't know that. As far as he knows, you're the Grim Reaper. We're going to let you talk to him, off the record, just to clarify his options." The SUV turned toward the Federal Detention Center. Inside the holding cell, Derek Vance sat on a metal bench. The orange jumpsuit scratched his skin. He was stripped of his badge, his gun, his dignity. He kept replaying the moment in the courtroom. The King of Siam line? How stupid could he have been? The heavy steel door buzzed and swung open. Vance looked up, expecting a lawyer. Instead, Magnus Thorne walked in. He wasn't wearing the suit jacket anymore, just a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing thick forearms. He carried 2 cups of coffee. He kicked the chair around and sat backward, facing Vance. He set 1 coffee on the table. "Black. 2 sugars. That's how you like it, right?" "I read your file." Vance stared at the coffee. "What do you want? Here to gloat?" "I don't gloat, Derek. I prosecute." Thorne took a sip of his own coffee. "You're looking at 20 years. Mandatory minimums. Civil rights violations carry heavy weight. And since you carried a firearm during the commission of a felony, add another 5. You'll be 65 when you get out. If you survive, cops don't do well in general population." Vance swallowed hard. "I'll go to PC, protective custody." "Maybe," Thorne shrugged. "Or maybe the feds put you in a facility where we can't guarantee your safety unless you have value." "I'm not a snitch," Vance muttered. "Everyone is a snitch, Derek. It's just a matter of price." Thorne leaned in. "We know about the blue wall. We know Captain Miller takes a 20% cut of all seizures. We know Rourke suppresses the complaints. You can't prove Miller is involved." "Not yet," Thorne admitted. "But we found the baggies in your locker. We found the cash. We have the video. You are going down, Derek. The ship is sinking. The only question is, do you want to be the guy who drowns or the guy who grabs the life raft?" Vance looked at the coffee. His hands were shaking. "If I talk," Vance whispered, "Miller will kill me." "Miller is a bureaucrat with a badge," Thorne scoffed. "He's not the cartel, and once we have him, he'll be in a cell right next to you. But if you give him to us, we can move you. Witness protection. A nice, quiet life in Arizona. No badge, but no shank in the shower either." Thorne stood up and checked his watch. "I have a press conference in 30 minutes. By the time I walk out that door, the offer expires. Rourke is already calling my office trying to cut a deal. If he gives us Miller first, you get nothing." This was a bluff. Rourke hadn't called, but Vance didn't know that. The prisoner's dilemma was a beautiful thing. Vance looked at the door, then at Thorne. The silence stretched for an agonizing minute. "It wasn't just cash," Vance said softly. Thorne stopped, his hand on the door handle. He didn't turn around. "Go on." "It wasn't just cash and drugs," Vance said, his voice trembling. "Miller. He was taking guns too. Drop guns, untraceable pieces. He was selling them back to the gangs, to the Latin kings." Thorne turned around slowly. This was bigger than corruption. This was arms trafficking. "Tell me everything," Thorne said, pulling a recorder from his pocket. Start from the beginning. The confession from Derek Vance was a roadmap to the heart of the corruption. But a roadmap is useless if you don't drive the car. Vance had revealed that Captain Richard Miller wasn't just skimming, he was liquidating the precinct's evidence locker. The drop guns, untraceable firearms seized from crime scenes and never logged, were being sold in bulk. And tonight, according to Vance, was the quarterly clearance sale. The location? The City Impound Lot B, a sprawling graveyard of rusted sedans and crushed trucks on the industrial waterfront. It was 2:40 a.m. Rain was falling in sheets, turning the dirt lot into a slurry of oil and mud. Magnus Thorne sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked tactical van. He had traded his navy suit for a Kevlar vest with Federal Prosecutor stenciled on the back in yellow, though he carried a sidearm on his hip. Beside him was Special Agent Reynolds of the FBI. "Thermal is picking up heat signatures in the main garage," Reynolds whispered, tapping the monitor. 6 tangos, 2 vehicles. One looks like a patrol cruiser. The other is a civilian truck. "That's Miller," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on the metal siding of the warehouse. "He uses his cruiser to move the product. Who suspects a police car?" "We have the perimeter sealed," Reynolds said. "On your green light." Thorne took a breath. This was the moment. The law was about to collide with the lawless. "Execute," Thorne said. The night exploded. Floodlights from 3 armored Bearcats snapped on simultaneously, bathing the impound lot in blinding white light. Sirens wailed, a chaotic symphony designed to disorient. "Federal agents, drop your weapons! On the ground! Now!" The amplified voice boomed over the rain. Inside the warehouse, panic erupted. The garage door began to close, but an armored ram on the front of the lead FBI vehicle smashed through it like it was made of paper. Thorne jumped out of the van, moving behind the tactical team. He entered the warehouse, his weapon drawn but pointed low. The scene was chaos. Several men in hoodies, members of the buyer gang, were already on the ground, zip-tied. But near the back, behind a stack of crates, a man in a police captain's uniform was holding a shotgun. It was Captain Miller. "Miller! Drop it!" Agent Reynolds screamed, training his rifle on the captain. Miller looked wild-eyed. He was cornered. He was a man who had spent 30 years being the predator, and he couldn't process being the prey. "You don't have jurisdiction here," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a sanctioned undercover operation. I am the captain of the 4th Precinct." "Not anymore, Richard," a voice called out from the shadows. The FBI agents parted. Magnus Thorne stepped forward, walking calmly into the center of the kill zone. He holstered his weapon, showing he was unafraid. Miller squinted against the glare of the tactical lights. "Thorne, the lawyer, you orchestrated this?" "You orchestrated this, Captain," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the vast metal shed. "When you decided that your badge was a license to steal, when you decided to sell death back to the streets you swore to protect." "I run this city," Miller spat. "You think a few feds scare me? I have judges in my pocket. I have the mayor on speed dial." Thorne reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up. "This is a federal indictment, Richard, signed an hour ago. Racketeering, arms trafficking, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and 19 counts of civil rights violations. Your judges can't help you. The mayor can't save you. You are now the property of the United States government." Miller's grip on the shotgun faltered. He looked at the laser sights dancing on his chest. He looked at Thorne's stone-cold face. He realized the game was over. Slowly, the shotgun clattered to the concrete floor. "Get him," Reynolds ordered. As the agents swarmed Miller, slamming him face first onto the hood of his own patrol car, Thorne walked up to him. He leaned down close to Miller's ear. Officer Vance sends his regards, Thorne whispered. Miller let out a roar of frustration as the cuffs clicked shut. The sound of steel on steel was the sweetest music Thorne had heard all week. 6 months later. The seasons had changed outside the massive stone walls of the federal courthouse, turning from the crisp leaves of autumn to the brutal, unforgiving grey of winter. It was fitting. Inside Courtroom 1, the atmosphere was just as cold, just as unforgiving. This wasn't the traffic court where Officer Vance had tried to frame a driver for a broken tail light. This was the United States District Court, a place where the air was thin, the wood paneling was dark, and the seal of the United States hung like a heavy iron shield behind the bench. The gallery was packed to capacity. It wasn't just reporters and legal junkies today. The front 3 rows were filled with a different kind of crowd, men and women in worn clothes, some weeping, some holding hands. These were the ghosts of the 4th Precinct, the victims of the Blue Wall, people who had lost jobs, custody of children, and years of their lives because Derek Vance needed a stat and Captain Miller needed a bonus. They were there to watch the monsters fall. Magnus Thorne sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. He wasn't trying the case. He was a witness and a victim. But his presence dominated the room. He wore a charcoal suit, darker than before, and sat with the stillness of a statue. Beside him sat David Sterling, the U.S. attorney. "They look smaller without the uniforms," Sterling whispered, leaning in. Thorne nodded slowly. "They always do." At the defense table sat 3 men who had once walked the streets like gods. Now, they were dressed in standard-issue federal orange jumpsuits, their wrists shackled to waist chains, their ankles bound in steel. Kyle Rourke, the once arrogant assistant district attorney, looked like a child who had been aged 10 years in 6 months. His hair was thinning, his skin pasty. He wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Derek Vance, the muscle, the enforcer, was slumped over. He had lost 30 pounds. The swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. He kept glancing at the door leading to the holding cells, as if expecting a shank to come flying out of the shadows. And Captain Richard Miller, even in chains, Miller tried to hold his chin up. He glared at the judge, glared at the jury box, which was empty now, as this was sentencing, and glared specifically at Magnus Thorne. He still believed, in some twisted corner of his mind, that he was the hero of this story. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice booming off the walls. The Honorable Judge Anthony Vargo entered. Vargo was a legend in the federal circuit, a man known as the Hammer. He didn't tolerate corruption. He viewed a dirty cop as infinitely worse than a street criminal because the cop broke a sacred oath. He sat down, adjusted his robes, and peered over his spectacles at the 3 men. "Be seated," Vargo said. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. "We are here for the sentencing in the matter of United States v. Miller, Vance, and Rourke," Judge Vargo began. "The defendants have been found guilty on all counts, including racketeering, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. I have reviewed the pre-sentencing reports. I have heard the victim impact statements. And frankly, in my 20 years on the bench, I have never seen a betrayal of public trust quite this systemic." He turned his gaze first to Kyle Rourke. "Mr. Rourke, please stand." Rourke stood up on shaky legs. His chains rattled, a lonely, pathetic sound. "Mr. Rourke," Judge Vargo said, his voice deceptively soft. "You were an officer of the court. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution. When Officer Vance brought you cases that smelled of rot, you didn't investigate. You didn't question. You buried the complaints. You suborned perjury. You prioritized your conviction rate over human lives. Your Honor, Rourke stammered, his voice cracking. I was young. I was pressured. Captain Miller made it clear that if I didn't play ball, my career was over. I just wanted to do a good job. I didn't know the extent. Stop! Vargo cut him off like a whip crack. You went to law school. You passed the bar. You knew exactly what was happening. You traded your ethics for a seat at the cool kids' table. You aren't a victim, Mr. Rourke. You are a parasite. Rourke flinched as if he'd been slapped. The state bar has already permanently disbarred you, Vargo continued, looking down at a paper. But that is not enough. For the count of conspiracy to obstruct justice, I sentence you to 60 months in federal prison. Rourke let out a sob. 5 years. Followed by 3 years of supervised release, Vargo added. And Mr. Rourke, I am recommending that you serve your time in a medium security facility. You wanted to be a tough-on-crime prosecutor? Now you can see what that looks like from the inside. Remand into custody. Rourke collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was ruined. No career, no future, just 5 years of fear. Next was Derek Vance. Mr. Vance, Vargo said. Vance stood up. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the floor. You were the instrument of this terror, Vargo said. You beat men and women. You planted drugs. You stole money. You ruined lives with a smile on your face. I know, Vance whispered. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't give Mr. Henderson back the 3 years he spent in jail, Vargo snapped, gesturing to the gallery. Sorry doesn't give Miss Davies her children back. Vance winced. However, Vargo softened slightly. The court acknowledges your cooperation. Your testimony was crucial in dismantling the wider network of corruption involving Captain Miller and the distribution gangs. You broke the blue wall of silence, albeit only after you were caught. Vance nodded. He was banking on this. He was praying for a miracle. The guidelines suggest a sentence of 25 years to life, Vargo said. Vance stopped breathing. But due to your 5K 1.1 motion for substantial assistance, I am departing downward. Vance exhaled. I sentence you to 14 years in federal prison. Vance's knees buckled. 14 years. He would go in a man of 40. He would come out an old man, broken and alone. And Mr. Vance, Vargo leaned forward. I am well aware of the dangers a former officer faces in prison. You requested a specific protective custody unit. I am granting that request. But do not mistake this for mercy. You will spend 23 hours a day in a cell to keep you safe. You built a cage for others, and now you will live in one of your own making. Vance nodded numbly. It was better than death, but only barely. Finally, the room turned its attention to the center of the storm. Richard Miller, Judge Vargo said. The name sounded like a curse. Captain Miller stood up. He didn't rattle his chains. He stood tall, pulling his shoulders back, his eyes burning with a defiance that bordered on insanity. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Vargo asked. Miller looked around the room, sneering at the victims in the gallery, and finally locking eyes with Magnus Thorne. I kept this city safe, Miller spat, his voice raspy but loud. You people, you sit in your ivory towers with your law degrees, judging the men who wade through the filth. I did what had to be done. I took guns off the street. You sold them back to the street, Thorne shouted from the gallery, breaking protocol. Order! Vargo banged his gavel, though he didn't look angry at Thorne. He looked back at Miller. I controlled the chaos, Miller yelled, his face turning red. I managed the gangs. Without me, this city burns. You think you're winning? You're just opening the gates for the wolves. I am a hero. I am—" "You are a drug dealer," Judge Vargo said. His voice wasn't loud, but it silenced Miller instantly. "You are a common criminal wearing a costume," Vargo continued, taking off his glasses and setting them down slowly. "You ran a racketeering enterprise from a police station. You ordered your officers to terrorize citizens so you could line your pockets. You didn't manage the chaos, Mr. Miller. You profited from it." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but Vargo raised a hand. "The evidence showed that the weapons you sold, the drop guns you put back on the street, were used in 3 separate homicides. The blood of those 3 people is on your hands just as surely as if you pulled the trigger." The courtroom was deadly silent. "Richard Miller, for the crimes of racketeering, arms trafficking, and deprivation of rights resulting in death, the guidelines offer only one appropriate remedy." Vargo looked Miller dead in the eye. "I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gallery erupted. A collective gasp was followed by the sound of weeping, tears of relief. A woman in the second row, whose son had been framed by Vance, cried out, "Thank you, Jesus!" Miller froze. The arrogance evaporated. For the first time, the reality hit him. He wasn't going to a white-collar resort. He wasn't coming back on appeal. He was going to die in a concrete box. "Furthermore," Vargo added, raising his voice over the noise, "I am ordering the forfeiture of all your assets. Your pension is revoked. Your properties are seized to pay restitution to the victims. You enter prison with nothing, sir. You leave this world with nothing." "You can't do this!" Miller screamed, lunging forward against the table. The U.S. Marshals were on him instantly, grabbing his arms. "I am the captain. I am the law." "Take them away," Vargo ordered, banging the gavel with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. As the Marshals dragged Miller out, kicking and screaming like a petulant child, Thorne watched. He watched the man who thought he was a king be reduced to a number. He watched Vance shuffle out, head down, weeping. He watched Rourke stare blankly at the ceiling. It was over. The infection had been cut out. The courtroom began to clear. The victims in the gallery were hugging each other, hugging the prosecutors. It was a scene of pure catharsis. Thorne stood up and buttoned his jacket. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was David Sterling. "You okay?" Sterling asked. "Yeah," Thorne said, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 6 months. "I'm okay." "You know," Sterling said, gesturing to the empty defense table, "most people would have just paid the ticket or taken the plea deal." "That's what they counted on," Thorne said. "They counted on fear. They forgot that fear only works if you don't know your rights, and if you don't have the power to fight back." "Well," Sterling smiled, "you certainly reminded them." Thorne walked out of the courtroom, down the marble hallway, and out the heavy brass doors of the courthouse. The air outside was biting cold, but it felt clean. The media circus was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust in his direction. Mr. Thorne, is justice served? What do you say to the families? Are you planning to run for district attorney?" Thorne paused on the top step. He looked at the sea of reporters. He thought about giving a speech. He thought about talking about systemic reform, about the need for vigilance. But he realized the verdict had spoken louder than he ever could. He simply nodded to the press, put on his sunglasses, despite the overcast sky, and walked down the steps. He reached his car, the same sleek black Mercedes S-Class. It was parked in a reserved spot now. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The smell of expensive leather greeted him. It was a sanctuary. He started the engine. The digital dashboard lit up. System check. Okay. Tail lights. Okay. Tires. Okay. He reached into the center console, the same place Vance had claimed he was reaching for a weapon, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the original citation Vance had written him that night. Failure to obey a lawful order. Resisting arrest. Thorne looked at it one last time. He ripped it in half, then in half again. He dropped the pieces into the cup holder. He put the car in drive and pulled out into the city traffic. The streets were busy. People were driving home to their families, unaware of the war that had just ended in the courthouse behind him. And that was how it should be. The job of the law wasn't to be the star of the show. It was to keep the road clear so people could live their lives. Thorne merged onto the highway, the city skyline reflecting in his rearview mirror. He checked his speedometer. Perfectly legal. He was just a driver again. But this time he knew, and the city knew, that if you came for him, you'd better come correct. Because Magnus Thorne didn't just know the law. He was the storm that followed the calm. The story of Magnus Thorne and Derek Vance is a fictional drama, yet it echoes a terrifying reality that plays out in courtrooms across the nation. It reminds us that power without accountability is tyranny, and that sometimes the only thing standing between an innocent person and a ruined life is the truth, and the means to prove it. Thorne was lucky. He had the badge, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back. But how many others don't? This story isn't just about a gotcha moment. It's about the fragility of justice and the importance of integrity. The karma that hit Vance and Miller was satisfying, but the real victory was the exposure of the system that protected them. What did you think of Magnus Thorne's strategy? Did Officer Vance deserve a harsher sentence, or was 12 years enough for turning on his boss? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories of heavy-hitting karma, courtroom drama, and justice served cold, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth always leaves a trail.